Welcome back to the class video for Module 4, the first of two modules devoted to Rousseau's On Social Contract. In the first part of Module 4, we looked at Rousseau's historical context. In the second part, we looked at the first 4 chapters of Book 1, which together constitute a kind of introduction to the work as a whole and is an extended reflection on the relationship between nature and convention, force and free will, necessity and morality, all culminating in Rousseau's denunciation of slavery in Chapter 4. Let's turn now in this section and look at the remaining chapters of Book 1, in which Rousseau describes his model of the social contract. The most important idea to grasp, which is very difficult for American readers to grasp because we come from a Lockean tradition, is the conceptual model implied or conveyed in the highlighted passage on the bottom of page 5. This passage is the keystone for understanding the difference between Locke's approach to the social compact and Rousseau. So let's look at the bottom of the right-hand column on page 5. A people, says Grotius, can give itself to a king. Then, according to Grotius, a people is a people before it gives itself. The gift is itself a civil act and implies public deliberation. It would be better, before examining the act by which a people gives itself to a king, to examine that by which it has become a people. For this act, being necessarily prior to the other, is the true foundation of society. The key concept to grasp here is that it is a two-stage process. First, there's a process by which we create a people, and then once the people is created, the people can then go on and create government. Government is a distinct thing from the people. So let's take just a moment to reflect on the implications of those conceptual terms. For Rousseau, of these two agreements, the first is by far the most important. That is, the act by which a people becomes a people is fundamental, and the choosing of a government is secondary or peripheral. Because it is that first agreement that implicates or obligates you as an individual, or every person as an individual. Hence, that's how government in society are rooted in human nature. And that difference, that emphasis on that first agreement and it being a two-stage process, is going to dramatically change Rousseau's threshold for revolution. That is to say, recall Locke. He has that binary model. First you're in the state of nature, and then you enter civil society. In order to revoke that contract, that is, to renege on civil society, was a dramatic decision for him that made him very anxious and put all kinds of threshold requirements and limitations around it, because he anticipated that the result of that would be a return all the way to the state of nature. For Rousseau, that first agreement by which a people is created is primary and irrevocable. The second agreement by which we create government is not particularly important, so you don't need a particularly high threshold to justify revolution. Revolution will only take you back to that previous state, the state of the collective. We'll see those implications unfold as we work our way through the remainder of the text. And indeed, when we get to the American text and we see how they're having to choose and are conflicted between these two different models. Here at the outset, it's worth asking or reflecting a little bit on just what this agreement can mean. That is to say, what is a people and how does a people come into existence? Now, on this question, which is so fundamental to understanding Rousseau's perspective, we American readers are uniquely ill-equipped to understand this concept, because if you ask an American what makes the Americans a people, our instinctive and kind of trained civic answer is, well, we all obey the Constitution. Americans are all those people who are subject to and abide by the U.S. Constitution. Some version of that answer. That is to say, an American civic culture, we are uniquely identified with the people being the government. Our civic identity is our national identity. Implicit in that, of course, is nothing else makes us Americans. That is, we're so diverse and heterogeneous that the American story is so grounded in the immigrant story and people coming from every background all claiming the American identity. Well, you do so essentially by agreeing to the precepts of our civil society. Well, that's exactly what Rousseau is not talking about here, right? Rousseau is trying to get you to think about, how does a people become a people before they unite under a constitutional order? And because we Americans sort of reject a fundamental identity outside of that, other than we all agree to be different, right? It's uniquely hard for American readers to get Rousseau's concept. Rousseau is essentially talking about, what does it mean to be French, right? What does it mean to be Swiss? What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be Belgian? What does it mean to be Saxon or Bavarian or Bohemian or Czech or Slavic? Think about that checkerboard of nations, that is, ethnic groups that identified distinct from the political or governing entities of 18th century Europe that we talked about in Rousseau's historical background. He's thinking about where those identities come from. Now, what is it that makes the French French, or the Germans Germans, or the Slavs Slavs, or the Hungarians Hungarians? The kinds of answers we're likely to give are sort of cultural difference, that is, different languages, different family organizations and patterns of property ownership and farming patterns and things like that. Different art and cultural preferences, different musical tastes. Right? We would be thinking about a cultural identity, and that's what Rousseau is trying to get us to consider. That we come to form cultural communities with a common identity before we choose government, and that identity perseveres even as government changes. Now, that makes a certain kind of sense. At least conceptually, you can imagine those separate boxes, except when did anybody ever get together and agree, make a consensual bargain, a compact, or a contract that say, we are us and we're going to drink wine and eat brie, and those people over the mountain ridge are them and they're going to drink beer and eat schnitzel, right? And we're going to call ourselves the French and they're going to call themselves the Germans. Those things emerge over historical development, but they're not the kinds of things that anybody ever gets together and makes an agreement about, or very rarely is that explicitly so. This is French art and that's German art. And this is the foundational conceptual difference between Locke's idea about what the contract is and Rousseau's. Locke gives us, again, because we're Americans, it's sort of intuitively commonsensical, the way Locke presents the contract. But it's really like going into a car dealership, right? And someone presents you a piece of paper, and there's a deal there, you can drive away with the car, here's the terms of which you owe us. That image in the second treatise of you emerging out of the state of nature, you're fed up with people stealing your apples, you get to look at the bargain proposed to you. You got to give up this many rights and you'll get this many protections. Do you want to do it or not? Right? That image is of us having a free will, self-conscious understanding of the agreement that we're entering into, and being able to accept or reject it based on our rational self-interest. Right? That's such a Lockean image of what the contract is here. What Rousseau is describing is something radically different. You never got a choice whether you wanted to be French or not. It is innate in you to prefer the things that the French prefer, right? To see the things that the French think are normal as normal, and the things that other cultures think are normal as to be antithetical and heretical. That is an identity and a set of preferences and choices that you never got to say, I do or I don't agree with, right? It is your cultural identity. It's in your in your subconscious, in your preconscious, out of the experience of your being raised in that culture. And this is the foundational conceptual difference between Locke and Rousseau and their images and description of what consent is, or convention versus contract are. So as we turn now back to the text, and he's going to describe the process of consent in the next chapter, understand that he's describing this process of you coming to understand your own cultural identity, not proposing to you a set of propositions, a set of exchange propositions to which you get to self-consciously say yes or no to. So let's turn now back to the text and see Rousseau's description of that process. Returning to chapter 6 then, the first thing we observe about Rousseau's description of the social compact is that he's not particularly interested in the debate about the state of nature and whether men are cooperative and rational fundamentally or fundamentally irrational and conflict-oriented. He begins chapter 6, I suppose men to have reached the point at which the obstacles in the way of their preservation in the state of nature show their power of resistance to be greater than the resources at the disposal of each individual for his maintenance in that state. That primitive condition can then subsist no longer, and the human race would perish unless it changed its manner of existence. Now, in fact, Rousseau is going to give us a little more elaboration on the conditions of the state of nature in chapter 8, and we'll turn to that next. But for the purposes of describing the social compact, he thinks he can succinctly summarize the paradox of the great social contract theorists of the century preceding him. In the highlighted passage at the bottom of the left-hand column, he writes, the problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. This is the fundamental problem of which the social contract provides the solution. So our goal is to gain protection while not having to give up freedom. But of course, in Locke's model, there was an inverse relationship. And in Hobbes too, if you remember Hobbes from the Foundation, there's an inverse relationship between protection and freedom. That is to say, Locke told us, you can remain free, but then you don't get any protection. If you want to join the contract, the exchange is give over your freedom in exchange for protection. Now, the main difference between Hobbes and Locke is Hobbes said you have to give over 100% of your rights in order to get 100% protection. And Locke is trying to negotiate, right? Yeah, you got to give up most of your rights, but you get to retain these few most important ones that I call property, right? And so for Locke, it's a bargain about just how much do you have to give up in order to gain what quantum of protection, and then you get to decide whether it's a good bargain for you. But in both of those, there's an inverse relationship between protection and freedom. What Rousseau is proposing here is essentially to square the circle, right? He's going to propose to you a model of the social contract which will give you both maximal protection and maximal freedom. How can we achieve that? Through the social compact described in the highlighted passages on the right-hand column. Starting at the second full paragraph there in the right-hand column, Rousseau summarizes, these clauses, properly understood, may be reduced to one: the total alienation of each associate, together with all his rights, to the whole community. The total alienation of each associate, together with all of his rights. Right? So that phrase you've seen before, that term alienation, he has used throughout the text from the very first chapter. And if you come down to the final highlighted passage that summarizes in italics on the right-hand column, each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and in our corporate capacity we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. Notice in each of these summary statements the repetition of this two-part consent, or this two-part construction. At the top, we're going to alienate each associate and also his rights. At the bottom, we're going to put each person and all his power in common. So in both places, we're giving away two things, which is a strange idea. It's sort of, if we imagine our rights as things that we carry around with ourselves and that can be taken from us, right? Hey, you took my rights. That's not a hard concept, and that's something that's familiar to us from Locke, right? You possess your rights, and because you possess them, I guess it makes sense that you can give them away, right? But it's basically the same kind of bargaining that we saw with Locke. But it also has this other thing. We're going to alienate not only each associate's rights, but we're going to alienate each associate. Each of us is not only going to put our power in common under the direction of general will, but each of us is going to put his person in common under the direction of the general will. We have to consent to give away ourselves. Now, what is the thing that is our self, right? And what Rousseau's talking about is our identities, our understanding of ourselves as a thing that is different than the group. We have to lose our ability to recognize ourselves as a distinct thing. He's talking about a profound, foundational psychological transformation. Now, what distinguishes this from the condition of slavery, which he just got done denouncing? Well, first, because it has to be voluntary, but if it is done in the collective, that is not one individual to another, but all of us to the group, not to any one of us, then it sets the foundational conditions of freedom. And those are the three criteria in the middle of the column. Between the two summary statements. So let's look quickly at those. In the second full paragraph, right where I left off, for in the first place, as each individual gives himself absolutely, the conditions are the same for all. And this being so, no one has any interest in making it burdensome for others. So because the conditions are the same for all, right, sameness, it is equality. We are all equal. Now, it's the equality of zero. It's the equality of we all gave up our own identity, but it is the same for all. Secondly, moreover, the alienation being without reserve, the union is as perfect as it can be, and no associate has anything more to demand. For, if the individuals retain certain rights, as there would be no common superior to decide between them and the public, each being on one point his own judge, would ask to be so on all. And of course, this is exactly the dilemma that Locke faced in his contractual bargaining around the social contract. He says you must submit, you must agree to abide by the umpire's decision, and if you don't, then you're still in the state of nature. You never join the social contract. Right? But he also wants you to retain some rights so that you can declare the government tyrannical and have the right to engage in revolution. Rousseau here is pointing out that contradiction. His solution: nobody gets any rights. Right? Zero rights, and there's no problem. Finally, in the next paragraph, finally each man, in giving himself to all, gives himself to nobody. And as there's no associate over whom he does not acquire the same rights as he yields others over himself, he gains an equivalent of everything he loses and an increase of force for the preservation of what he has. Now this is a wonderful kind of bumper sticker line. Each man, in giving himself to all, gives himself to nobody. From an Anglo-American perspective, right? This is a classic example of what reads to American readers as kind of nonsense doublespeak. What in the heck can Rousseau mean by, in giving yourself to all, you give yourself to nobody? Well, of course, what he means is you give yourself to no other individual person. You only submit to the group, the judgment of the collective. Right? Now, the problem, of course, and we'll turn to this later in the text, is, well, then who gets to say what the collective wants? And that's the problem of the government. But here you have to understand this very different notion of what freedom is. The freedom is zero. So let's take just a moment to summarize. So for Rousseau, the fundamental problem is, how can we get both freedom and security? What Locke and the other contract writers had told us was an inverse relationship. You can have one or the other, but you can't have both. How can we do that? Through absolute submission, through no one having any reserved rights. And by a focus on the collective, the all, not any one person. And he's going to call that principle, the all, the collective, the general will. And the general will is synonymous with the sovereign. The conceptual problem that poses, particularly for us American writers, trying to wrap our minds around this continental tradition of social democracy, is what in the heck can alienation mean? What does that have to do with consent, right? It doesn't look anything like what Locke described as consent, which seems so intuitively obvious to us. How is it possible that I could agree to give over knowing who I am, right? How could I refuse to acknowledge that I have an individual existence and interest that is either helped or hurt by the actions of the groups that I belong to? This is the conceptual problem or ambiguity that's going to pervade Rousseau's writing. What is this thing he's calling the general will? And we're going to turn to that. That's essentially the central focus of Book 2. Let's turn back to the text now and return to the problem of the state of nature that presents itself in Chapter 8. If we return to the text, we see that Rousseau follows Chapter 6 with Chapter 7, the sovereign, in which he makes his first kind of broad strokes description of this thing we created, the general will, through the social compact. The sovereign is really the main idea, the central subject of Book 2. So let's skip Chapter 7 for now because it serves as a good introduction to our discussion of Book 2 to follow. And if we jump to Chapter 8, what's called the civil state, we'll find actually the best description we'll get anywhere in Rousseau of his version of the state of nature. And if we understand Rousseau's conception of the state of nature, it'll give us a better foundation for understanding this idea of alienation and how we can give over ourselves, the nature of Rousseauian consent. Rousseau writes at the beginning of Chapter 8, "The passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces a very remarkable change in man. by substituting justice for instinct in his conduct and giving his actions the morality they had formerly lacked. Then only, when the voice of duty takes the place of physical impulses and the right of appetite, does man, who so far had considered only himself, find that he is forced to act on different principles and to consult his reason before listening to his inclinations. Although in this state he deprives himself of some advantage which he got from a nature, he gains in return others so great, his faculties are so stimulated and developed, his ideas are so extended, his feelings so ennobled, and his whole soul so uplifted that did not the abuses of this new condition often degrade him below that which he left, he would be bound to bless continually the happy moment which took him from it forever, and instead of a stupid and unimaginative animal, made him an intelligent being and a man. Now this is quite a poetic description, right? Full of emotional words describing these two different states. The overall feeling is, though, that the transition from nature to civil society is an ascension, right? It's an uplift, right? We're improving our conditions by joining society. And recall how different that is than Locke. In Locke, we love the state of nature. Everything was wonderful except for those few rascals stealing our apples. And, oh, God, we had to give up our rights. We had to submit to authority and take on a lower status in civil society to gain protection for those few things that we could manage to hold on to. So there's a dramatically different emotional tone. Again, let's pause here and think about this a little bit more. All right, if we begin by focusing on the top half of the screen, and you notice the two boxes on the left and the right, the sets of traits that Rousseau ascribes to both the state of nature and then civil society. The state of nature is characterized by instinct, impulse, appetite, stupid, unimaginative, animal. And then society is characterized by justice, morality, reason, nobility, intelligence. And you get the sense of the transformation that we go through from our natural state to our social state. And then set in a backdrop there are Locke's declension narrative, right? From freedom to the surrender of rights and submission to the umpire. This is a kind of traditional or classic way of contrasting the Lockean and the Rousseauian models of the social contract. Locke is traditionally described as a declension model and Rousseau as an ascension model. Now, this distinction is profound in its consequences for the rest of their political theory. Imagine then anticipating revolution in each of these two models, and you're mad at the government and you're trying to decide whether you want to go grab your gun and resist and fight for your freedom. In the Lockean model, there is always an impulse towards overthrowing the government because the state of nature is such a wonderful place. And if I could just get the government off my back, then I could live in freedom. Right? And I could have, it's those big guys taking my apples are a constant pain, but if I put up with them, I otherwise get to exercise all of my rights. So there's an impulse, a trigger towards freedom in Locke, in which revolution is an embrace of freedom. But it's just the opposite in the Rousseauian or the continental model. Now, notice that justice, morality, duty, reason, nobility, and intelligence come from society, not from government, right? From the general will, from the collective, and we'll come back to that. But there's no impulse to return to your natural state in the Rousseauian way of conceiving the right of democratic revolution. You wouldn't want to go back to nature. Nature is an awful place. You may very well want to overthrow the tyranny of government, but your recourse or your safe haven is back in society, not back in nature. And that's a profound psychological difference between Lockean civic cultures and Rousseauian civic cultures. Now, the implications of this difference for one's conception of our fundamental human nature are profound. And if you look at the bottom half of the screen, then we can return to this graphic that illustrates the Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau's approach to the state of nature. Hobbes and Rousseau agree that the state of nature is an awful place. In the classic line from the Leviathan, Hobbes describes the state of nature as solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. And we just read Rousseau describe the state man in the state of nature as a stupid and unimaginative animal. Locke, of course, famously can't make up his mind. He thinks we are rational in one moment, except when we're not, and we're using force and violence. And that duality in Locke is characteristic of the Lockean approach. But as we read Rousseau's description of the state of nature, we see fundamentally different implications for the nature of reason. Even though Hobbes and Rousseau agree that the state of nature is a terrible place, they disagree on why. Hobbes thinks that the state of nature is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, exactly because men are rational in nature, and the most rational way to relate to other people when there's no common superior is to lie, cheat, steal, and do whatever you have to do to protect yourself, because cooperation and relying on others is a terrible strategy, Hobbes thinks. He thinks that is completely irrational to trust other people if there's no common superior to enforce your agreement. So Hobbes believes that man is naturally rational, and it's that very reason that leads him to be violent in the state of nature. Notice the difference with Rousseau. Man does not gain reason until after he joins society. And so, yes, he is conflict-oriented, has no sense of justice and morality, but it's simply because he has not fully become a man yet. He has not gained all the attributes of human capacity, agency, accountability, convention, and agreement, right? All those things that we talked about through that long introduction, chapters 1 through 4, about the nature of voluntarism and consent and morality and accountability comes with free will. Man does not possess that in the state of nature. Now, that has profound epistemological consequences. If reason is not natural, right, then is a objectively true statement like 1 + 1 = 2 not naturally rational, that is, in the state of nature? Would you not recognize the truth and everyone enforce the common truth that objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by a contrary force? Or are those things only true to the extent that your society endorses them as true? That is to say, you can't understand 1 + 1 = 2 until after you join society. So if your society, your culture tells you 1 + 1 = 3, then guess what? 1 + 1 does equal 3. Well, of course Rousseau would not affirm that, right? But it's a clear implication of reason not being natural. That is to say, there's nothing in the universe that is naturally logical. Well, he can't mean that. But what he's trying to do is counter what's equally absurd about Locke's claims about reason, that all men are naturally rational, and if they'll merely consult their reason, they would cooperate, and so on. Well, we know that men are not naturally rational in that sense, and so there's a distinction between things that are objectively logical and true and things that are socially constructed. That is, claims like do unto others as you would have others do unto you, or all men are created equal. That these are cultural assertions, right, that aren't objectively true in nature. And so that trick that Locke was trying to pull on us, right? He calls reason a law of nature, and so he wants us to think that reason is like gravity, right? That reason is like mathematical truths. And Rousseau is trying to present an alternative portrait that explains the rationality, the reason, the moral obligation of quote-unquote truths that are not objectively or empirically true the way that mathematical or the sort of the theorems of natural science are true, right? And so that's what Rousseau is trying to get at. But the implications, of course, are then culture, society, its claims on what are right are higher than any individual's claims on what is true or right. Because you can't reason until after you join society. So society or culture is primary. This is a foundational difference between Lockean approaches to consent and reason and Rousseauian approaches. And if you understand Rousseau's, what he's trying to get at here, then you understand why he uses that word alienate, right? To surrender and to give over. And he means in that a kind of voluntarism, because why would you ever resist becoming just and moral and having duty and reason, nobility and intelligence? Of course that is your yearning, is to become fully human. And so it is voluntary in that sense, right? But not in the sense of, hey, you put a piece of paper in front of me and I got to weigh the benefits and the costs and make a decision for my own self-interest. It was never an either or. You were always going to be compelled towards making the choice of becoming fully human and knowing your true rights. This is so foundationally different, and it creates such a foundationally different cultural psychology. What's the relationship between the individual and the collective? It's at the root of the difference between Lockean and Rousseauian approaches to democracy. All right, so let's take one more step back in the text and look at the rights of property. So returning now to chapter 9, the final chapter of book 1, we're reminded the critical role that property played in Locke's theory, right? Property was not simply land and horses and apples, but it was all the rights that you possess. Locke described all of that as your property. So of course Rousseau now, describing the civil state in chapter 8, has to come to property as the premier example or the central focal example of what happens to your rights or the things that you possess. And understanding Rousseau's description of the state of nature and its ascension model, we are prepared to understand that you're not going to bring anything with you from nature. You have no rights in nature. You don't possess reason. The nature of your consent is not a contract of bargaining your rights for the other, right? So he starts chapter 9. Each member of the community gives himself to it at the moment of its foundation, just as he is, with all the resources at his command, including the goods he possesses. So you can read that from a Lockean perspective as, well, I own these goods, they were mine, and then I had to alienate everything to join the collective, and the collective took what was mine, right? And he says, following, this act does not make possession and changing hands change its nature and become property in the hands of the sovereign, etc. So the beginning of this, if you don't take into account Rousseau's description in chapter 8, can sound like they're taking my stuff. And indeed, as he's trying to distinguish in the body of this chapter sort of 3 tiers of claims, right? 3 types of rights. Only the final one, the culminating one, is actually real property or a true right. The other ones, even though he calls them rights, are lesser rights, and sorting out that hierarchy is the goal of interpreting the chapter. So come to the bottom of the right-hand column there. The right of the first occupier, though more real than the right of the strongest, becomes a real right only when the right of property has already been established. Now this is a classic kind of Rousseauian gobbledygook sentence that American students read and they just throw up their hands in frustration and say this guy's writing nonsense. But we can tease it apart. The right of the first occupier is more real than the right of the strongest, but it becomes a real right only when the right of property has been established. So we have three rights being described here. There's a right of first occupier, there's a right of the strongest, and then there's a right of property. Right? These three things. They're all real, but to a greater or lesser extent. And the least real of all of these is the right of the strongest. A little bit more real is the right of first occupier, and then the most real, or the truly real, is the right of property itself. So let's tease those apart. He gives us a little more clue. We have an idea of what the right of the strongest is from those first 4 chapters. That is to say, he doesn't deny that slavery exists. There are masters who force people into bondage, but it can never exist as a true right or a legitimate or a valid claim. So he's talking about a similar thing here. There, in the state of nature, there are people who claim apple trees, and they will beat you up if you try to take any apples. They possess that. That's the right of the strongest. But then he comes to the right of first occupancy on the left-hand column of page 9. In the highlighted passage in the middle, he says, in granting the right of first occupancy to necessity and labor, are we not really stretching it as far as we can go? Is it possible to leave such a right unlimited? Is it to be enough to set foot on a plot of common ground in order to be able to call yourself at once the master of it? Well, in this short passage, you should recall immediately our discussion of the dilemma of Locke's discussion of the right of property, right? He says, simply grab an apple from the tree, eat it, and it becomes yours. Well, okay, fine, I've got no objection to that. But then do you get to claim the whole tree, right? Merely by setting foot on a plot of common ground, can you deny everybody else access to the tree? And Locke's answer to that was, well, you can't take more than you need, if you remember the law of waste. Oh, but men cheat on that by converting things into money, so gosh shucks, I guess some people are going to become richer than others in nature. And Rousseau is calling foul on that reasoning here, right? He acknowledges the right of first occupancy. I was here first. What's that based on? Necessity and labor. Remember Locke's description. God created me as a resource-consuming machine. If I don't take the apple off the tree and consume it, I will die, and I will defeat God's purpose for creating me and putting me on the earth. So Rousseau is acknowledging that necessity and labor are a higher claim than simply strength and power and violence. But isn't that stretching it as far as we can go? There's a higher right, Rousseau is saying, here on the right-hand column of page 9 in the highlighted first full paragraph. The peculiar fact about this alienation, that is, when we alienate our goods to the collective, is that in taking over the goods of individuals, the community, so far from despoiling them, only assures them of legitimate possession and changes usurpation into a true right and enjoyment into proprietorship. Thus the possessors, being regarded as depositories of the public good and having their rights respected by all members of the state and maintained against foreign aggression by all its forces, have by a cession of which benefits both the public and still more themselves, acquire, so to speak, all that they gave up. So a true right requires the acknowledgement of the community. That is, say, when do I know that Locke asks, when do I know that the apple I plucked from the tree is mine? He says, when I pulled it off, when I ate it, when I washed it, etc., at what moment? Well, the question he didn't ask was, well, when you went to the proposition that he didn't consider was, well, when you went to the others living in the area and said, do you mind if I pluck an apple from a tree? And when they say, sure, go ahead, pluck an apple from a tree, I can see you're hungry, at that moment, the man knew that that apple was his, at the moment of community acknowledgement. So let's take a moment again and summarize. Rights in the state of nature can only be imposed by force. There is no reason, there is no justice, there is no morality in nature, Rousseau believes, right? Very different than Locke. Therefore, any claims that are made in nature have to be less than claims made in society. The right of first occupier has the justification of necessity and labor, that is, God created us as resource-consuming machines, but that right is inherently self-limiting. It's a kind of a negative right. I have a right to not go out of existence, right? I have a right to as much property as required for me to not die. It's a negative right. The full and complete right comes about when the public recognizes, or the community recognizes your claim. That is to say, rights are, in the Rousseauian perspective, intrinsically social concepts. Locke's idea of natural rights makes no sense from a Rousseauian perspective. Locke would tell us that if you were the only person on the planet, right? There was one human being on the planet, that person would be in full and complete possession of all their rights, right? Because your rights don't depend on other people. They are innate in you. They come out of the nature of the creature that God made you as. For Rousseau, it's exactly the opposite, right? There is no right if no one else acknowledges it. Rights are intrinsically social concepts, and natural rights are gibberish. They're nonsense talk. The only right you could have in nature is a right based on force, right, which can never be valid. It can never be a convention. So we see just how completely opposite the Rousseauian approach to the social compact is from the Lockean approach. Let's turn now in the next segment and look at this thing we've created, this authority called the general will or the sovereign.